Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco. Sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
Don't peek.
3, 4.
In a Baltimore, Maryland suburb, a game of hide-and-seek turns deadly for a 9-year-old girl. Witnesses ID a suspect and trap him in a web of circumstantial evidence.
What does she look like?
8 years later, only DNA technology can render the final verdict. In California, a woman is viciously attacked in her sleep by a suspected serial killer. After she slips into a coma, investigators struggle to identify a suspect. When she regains consciousness, she IDs her attacker, and he is no stranger. In the past, eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence could spell doom for a suspect without an ironclad alibi. Today, forensics experts are clearing the falsely accused using DNA to uncover proof of innocence. On the afternoon of July 25th, 1984, in the Baltimore, Maryland suburb of Rosedale, police responded to a father's frantic 911 call. Thomas Hamilton reported that his 9-year-old daughter Dawn was missing. His sister had been babysitting Dawn and Dawn's cousin Lisa that morning.
It's just behind the apartment houses.
8-year-old Lisa told police that she and Dawn had left to go play at a nearby pond around 10:30. The surrounding wooded area was a great place to play hide-and-go-seek.
15, no, 20.
1,
No
2,
peeking.
3,
But after some time, the two became separated.
6, 7.
Lisa couldn't find her cousin and thought that maybe Dawn had decided to go back home. But she had not returned. After an hour passed without a word, the aunt became concerned and contacted her brother. Thomas Hamilton knew that Dawn was familiar with the woods and thought it was unlikely that she had simply become lost. He feared that something terrible had happened. A search party made up of family, friends, and law enforcement officers began combing the wooded area behind the apartment complex. After several hours, their efforts had turned up nothing. Then, around 5 o'clock, one of the searchers made an ominous discovery. A pair of child's underwear was found hanging from a tree branch. Investigators quickly began searching the immediate area. Within a few minutes, their worst fears were confirmed. Lying face down in a pile of brush, they found the lifeless body of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton.
Got a body here. Appears to be a little girl. I'm not feeling the pulse.
Her skull had been crushed,
On the north side of the pond, just up the hill. We need some help.
and there were indications that she had been sexually assaulted. Evidence technicians were dispatched to the scene. They preserved the girl's underwear, hoping some trace of her killer remained. Investigators collected a large piece of cinder block found near the victim's head. It appeared to be consistent with having caused the trauma to Dawn's skull. The body was removed from the scene and sent to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Word of the young girl's death quickly spread through the city. Tony Pipitone, a reporter for the Baltimore Evening Sun at the time of the homicide, followed the investigation. The murder of Dawn Hamilton would soon become front-page news.
This was a huge story for this area. I mean, it's not every day a 9-year-old girl disappears and then turns up murdered. There were a lot of people out there. There was a lot of concern about who the killer was and whether they would find this killer.
Investigators hoped the autopsy might provide some clues to the killer's identity. The medical examiner determined that Dawn Hamilton had not died as a result of the blunt force trauma to the head. After being beaten, she was then strangled. Though there were also indications that the young girl had been sexually assaulted, the medical examiner found no evidence of rape. However, a minuscule amount of biological evidence was recovered from the underwear. The samples were collected and analyzed, but in the days before DNA testing was available, examiners were unable to provide police with a specific genetic profile of the killer. Investigators turned to the public for help, but no leads were developed.
I want to ask you about what happened at the pond.
But a short while later, 2 boys from the Rosedale neighborhood came in to speak with police. They had seen Dawn with a strange man at the pond just hours before the young girl's body was found. The boys had been searching the area for turtles earlier that morning. When they spotted a stranger fishing by the side of the pond, they decided to show off their catch.
Lisa!
As they were talking to the man, Dawn Hamilton emerged from the woods. She was looking for her cousin Lisa and asked if the boys would help her. They declined, but the stranger offered to help. Moments later, Dawn disappeared into the woods with the man. The boys described the stranger as being about 6'5", having curly blonde hair and a mustache. With the help of a police sketch artist, the face of the murder suspect began to take shape. For everyone following the investigation, it was clear that this was a huge break for police.
They had the 2 boys who had seen her go down this trail with this man who had offered to help her find her friend. And they believed whoever that man was would be key to solving this case.
The composite sketch of Dawn Hamilton's suspected killer was quickly distributed through the media. Police also took the drawing door to door throughout Rosedale. Several neighbors claimed to have seen the man lurking around the area on the day of the murder. But no one had seen him before then, and no one knew his name. As the investigation threatened to stall, pressure to solve the case mounted. Again, police turned to the media for help.
It's Tony Pipitone.
Desperate to generate a lead, detectives released a psychological profile of Dawn's killer through all area newspapers.
The detectives had this profile done that said that whoever was responsible for this crime may have had an argument with a woman, a domineering woman in his life, may have been projecting that anger at that woman at this little girl. They said that whoever did this, according to this profile, grew up around the water because he was near the pond and where these boys were fishing and had gone to this pond as some kind of refuge in a troubled time.
And what's your name?
Hundreds of tips poured into police.
Thanks for calling.
One anonymous caller said he recognized the composite and the psychological description as a man he knew named Kirk Bloodsworth. A detective who overheard the conversation was familiar with that name. Kirk Bloodsworth had been reported missing by his wife, and the report was filed shortly after Dawn Hamilton was found murdered. Believing there may be a connection, investigators quickly arranged to speak with Bloodsworth's wife. She said in the weeks before Dawn's murder, she and her husband's marriage began to deteriorate.
We had a big fight last.
And why hasn't it been paid yet?
Throwing things at me.
Kirk accused her of spending beyond their means. Frustrated, she fought with him constantly. As the tensions mounted, Kirk became distant and preoccupied. A week or so after Dawn's murder, Kirk disappeared. She hadn't heard from him since.
How long had he been missing when you filed the report?
Investigators realized that Kirk Bloodsworth was involved in a turbulent relationship, just as the profile of the killer had indicated.
Well, think we got everything?
And, like the profile also suggested, he was drawn to the water. Kirk's wife said that her husband may have returned to his hometown, located on the Chesapeake Bay.
Using that profile, it all fit together. Kirk Bloodsworth grew up on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was from a fisherman family.
Kirk Bloodsworth was now the prime suspect in the murder of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton. But as long as his whereabouts remained uncertain, so did the prospects of solving this case. Authorities in the Baltimore, Maryland suburb of Rosedale believed they had finally identified a suspect in the brutal sexual assault and murder of 9-year-old Dawn Hamilton, whose body was discovered in a wooded area a few hundred yards from her home. An anonymous caller had identified a composite sketch of the suspect as resembling a man named Kirk Bloodsworth, who disappeared a week after the murder. Bloodsworth's wife speculated he had returned to his hometown of Cambridge on Maryland's eastern shore. Police canvassed the small fishing community. They located one of Bloodsworth's friends. He confirmed that the suspect had in fact recently returned to Cambridge. Bloodsworth told him that he had done something terrible and couldn't return to Baltimore. The friend didn't ask any more questions. He told police where Bloodsworth was currently staying. The suspect was contacted and brought in for questioning. Though Kirk Bloodsworth denied any involvement in the homicide, he was unable to recount exactly where he was at the time the murder occurred. Detectives next asked him what he had done that was so terrible that he couldn't return to Baltimore. Bloodsworth responded that he had failed to take his wife out for a taco salad dinner, and he knew she would never forgive him. To police, the explanation was ludicrous. Investigators produced a large piece of cinder block, similar to the one found at the crime scene, and a photo of the victim to see how the suspect would react.
They placed the rock in the interview room without referring to it specifically, and they watched his reaction. And I remember one of the detectives saying, you could see him just kept going, staring back at that rock. You know, his eyes would shift, back at that rock, back at that rock.
She got hit over the head with a cinder block.
Everything about the suspect led authorities to believe that he was Dawn Hamilton's killer.
That was my day off, one of my days.
Now, 2 decades later, Kirk Bloodsworth recalls that there was nothing he could have said to convince them he was not involved in the murder.
And they kept drilling me, and all I kept saying was, I didn't do it. I'm telling you, I didn't do it. No, I might not know exactly where I was right then and there right now, but I didn't do it. I know whatever it wasn't killing a little girl that day.
Stop me, all right?
But the evidence continued to suggest otherwise. The boys who helped create the composite sketch of the suspect were shown a photo lineup. Though Bloodsworth was shorter and heavier than the boys had described, and his hair was a different color, they picked him out as the man they had seen with Dawn near the pond.
Sir,
Several Rosedale residents also identified photographs of Bloodsworth as the man they saw hanging around the day of the murder. In the early morning hours of August 9, 1984, police traveled to Bloodsworth's cousin's home on the Eastern Shore, where he was staying at the time.
It was 2:45 in the morning, and he said, "There he is." And I physically turned around and looked the other way because I was expecting them to see, my cousin's boyfriend or something, or somebody else, not me. And I was just in total shock by the fact that there was 20 people on the lawn with guns and police cars. They were surrounded the house, front and back, all over the place.
Don Hamilton.
Kirk Bloodsworth was charged with first-degree murder. And though the case against him was circumstantial, prosecutors sought the harshest penalty.
You had the boys who identified him as being the man that went in the woods with Don Hamilton. It was eyewitness identification. There was nothing forensically solid placing him at the scene or placing him as a killer of this girl.
Still, it took less than 3 hours for the jury to find the defendant guilty of murder and sexual assault. 2 weeks later, 21-year-old Kirk Bloodsworth returned for sentencing.
Kirk stood up and said, "This is a travesty. This is misjustice. He would never do that to a girl." The judge sentenced him to death.
One of the most horrible feelings I ever had was when they sentenced me to death and the courtroom erupted in applause for my execution.
From prison, Bloodsworth committed himself to overturning his conviction. He eventually received an appeal, and at a second trial, the judge commuted his death sentence to 2 consecutive life terms. But for a man claiming he had nothing to do with the murder of Don Hamilton, that was hardly a consolation. Kirk Bloodsworth dedicated himself to finding irrefutable proof of his innocence, no matter how long it took. 8 years into a double life sentence for the murder of 9-year-old Don Hamilton, Kirk Bloodsworth was no closer to convincing Maryland authorities that he had been wrongly convicted.
I talked to anyone and everyone that I could. The person in the visiting room that I didn't even know, the guard that was walking me from there, the dental technician at sick call, the priest that comes see me every week. I wrote thousands of letters over the 8-year period. I just kept trying to get somebody to listen to me. And all it did was fall on deaf ears.
Then, several years later, he learned of a new forensic technology where DNA analysis was being used to convict criminals. Bloodsworth had an idea.
I thought, well, if it can implicate somebody and prove that they did do it, it can also exonerate a person, set them free.
Dr. Ed Blake of the Forensic Science Associates Lab in Northern California agreed that recent advancements in DNA technology could now offer Bloodsworth hope that previously didn't exist.
Well, at the time that Don Hamilton was murdered, there was no DNA technology for all intents and purposes. It's not that the science didn't know about DNA. Certainly, generally, science did know about DNA. It's just that the technology for doing work in a forensic setting hadn't evolved to the point where that technology was useful in a forensic setting.
Fortunately for Kirk Bloodsworth, things had changed since the mid-1980s. Examiners began looking into the case. The only item that potentially held exonerating evidence was Dawn's underwear found at the crime scene. Examiners, however, were confronted with 2 immediate problems. First, there was no guarantee that any genetic material remained on the garment. Secondly, even if there was, the evidence had been stored in a non-climate controlled environment for nearly 9 years, making it likely that any DNA samples would be too degraded to be useful. But examiners were in luck. A stain found on the fabric appeared to be a trace amount of biological evidence. Under a high-powered microscope, examiners confirmed that they had found a viable sample. One single gene strand was located. In the past, this minute sample would have been too small for testing. But now scientists had a new technique, referred to as Pcr analysis. The technique allows examiners to isolate a single gene strand containing DNA material. Once isolated, the DNA is then copied millions of times over, so that enough copies of a specific gene can be readily subjected to analysis.
You can think about DNA like the letters in a book. The letters in a book, which are formed into sentences, and the sentences are formed into paragraphs, and the paragraphs into chapters. A book has a 26-letter code. Well, DNA has a 4-letter code. The PCR process, in effect, searches the entire book of sentences to copy the one sentence that you're interested in looking at, and then copying those over and over so the sentence is easier to read.
The procedure was successful. After comparing the genetic profile of Kirk Bloodsworth to the one generated from the evidence, Dr. Blake concluded that Bloodsworth could not have killed Dawn Hamilton. The inmate was contacted with the news.
I had tears running down my face and my hands were up in the air. I went down the tier in front of the cell screaming that it's over. Now I remember throwing my hands up in the air like this and just totally elated.
These were Kirk Bloodsworth's last seconds behind bars.
Maryland's governor immediately pardoned Bloodsworth. On June 28, 1993, after spending nearly 9 years behind bars, he was released from prison. He was later awarded $300,000 in compensation. Though he returned home to the Eastern Shore, the homecoming was bittersweet. Kirk's mother had not lived to see him a free man.
My mom knew. She knew her son. She knew anybody that she raised was not like that. And I guess all moms think that way, but she knew her son well. Knew me well. Well enough to know that I was innocent of what I was in there for.
For police in Rosedale, Maryland, as long as Dawn Hamilton's real killer remains at large, the investigation into her murder will never be closed. In Maryland, an innocent man was freed thanks to advanced forensic technology. A convicted killer in Southern California also claims to be paying the price for another man's crime. Around 2 a.m. on September 30th, 1979, Kevin Greene returned to his Tustin, California apartment after leaving to pick up some fast food. Though he was only gone for half an hour, clothes were now scattered around the residence. On the couple's bed, he found his pregnant wife, Diana, unconscious. She was bleeding badly. Greene quickly called police. Police and emergency personnel raced to the scene. Diana was alive, but in critical condition. She had been savagely beaten. After stabilizing the victim, paramedics rushed Diana to the hospital. There, the 20-year-old expectant mother lapsed into a coma. Crime scene technicians began scouring the residence, looking for any trace of the assailant that may have been left behind. But no fingerprints or any stray hairs or fibers were found. There was no indication that anything had been stolen from the apartment. Blood and trace amounts of what appeared to be biological evidence were recovered from the bed. With the only witness to the assault in a coma, police turned to her husband, Kevin Greene, for answers. The Marine Corps corporal told investigators that he and Diana had friends over for drinks earlier that evening.
Won't be long, honey.
Around 1:30 a.m., shortly after the guests left, Kevin was hungry and decided to go out for some fast food. There were several parties in the neighborhood. Kevin forgot to lock the door. As he made his way to his car, he noticed an African-American male walking aimlessly down the street. He had never seen the man before. But with all of the parties going on, Greene thought nothing of it. When he returned a half hour later, he saw the same man climbing into a black van. He didn't get a good look at the stranger's face. After watching the van pull away, Greene made his way inside. Kevin now believed that the stranger was involved in the assault on Diana. He added that his and Diana's marriage was a good one. To this day, Kevin Greene can't imagine why anyone would have attacked his wife.
There's no reason in my mind. I can't think of any warnings I've heard or any reference to anything like this. She doesn't have any enemies. I don't have any enemies. Why would this happen? What has happened?
At the crime lab, technicians began trying to answer those questions. Biological evidence recovered from the victim's body and the bed confirmed Diana Greene had been sexually assaulted. But in the days before DNA profiling, there was little investigators could do to tie this sample to a specific individual, even if a suspect emerged. And that wasn't the only obstacle facing investigators. Though the victim was still alive, Costa Mesa homicide detective Barbara Geisler knew she would have to make her case without the eyewitness testimony of Diana Greene.
Her injuries to her head was described to me by the doctors at the hospital as if she had fallen off a two-story building head first. And it was really a miracle that she survived. And so she suffered from lapse of memory.
It's not looking good. I think some of your problems flow.
As soon as investigators began reviewing the details of Diana Greene's assault, something immediately caught their attention. The MO was frighteningly similar to 4 unsolved rapes and murders that had occurred throughout Orange County within the past 9 months. All the young female victims were found sexually assaulted and brutally beaten to death. And in each homicide, the killer apparently entered the victims' residences through unlocked doors.
No.
Nothing was taken from any of the apartments, suggesting the perpetrator had not been motivated by robbery. Though Diana was the only victim who was married and the only victim to have survived, detectives were convinced the crimes were connected.
The apartment was downstairs. She was home alone at the time of the incident. The apartment did not appear to be ransacked. There didn't appear to be anything taken. There was no theft or burglary involved. She was sexually assaulted and also bludgeoned. That's enough similarity certainly to get your attention.
Though Diana Greene had miraculously survived an attack by a serial killer, her unborn baby girl was barely clinging to life. The day after the assault, while still lingering in a coma, the situation turned critical.
A nurse came in to do the next check on the baby. She was listening to the baby's heartbeat, and then she lost it. And she kept looking for the heartbeat, and kept looking, she couldn't find it. There wasn't any warning. There wasn't any anything anybody could do. The baby's heartbeat stopped. And by the time they realized that that's actually what had happened, the baby hadn't just turned. It was too late.
The serial killer, who the press dubbed the bedroom basher, had claimed another innocent life. And though publicity surrounding the murder of the unborn baby sent shockwaves through the community, no solid leads were developed. Then, 8 days after Diana Greene was assaulted, police were called to an apartment complex just 3 blocks from her residence. There had been another homicide. The body of 24-year-old Deborah Kennedy was discovered by her roommate. The coroner at the scene concluded that the young woman had been sexually assaulted and bludgeoned to death in her first-floor apartment. Police were able to collect biological evidence of rape, but no other clues to the killer's identity were found. Tustin Police Lieutenant Bill Fisher was assigned the case. It was clear to him that Deborah Kennedy and Diana Greene had both been victimized by the same predator.
So we found that they were both in their early 20s. They lived about a mile and a half apart from one another. The attacks themselves were both very similar, blows to the forehead with some kind of a blunt object, and they had both been sexually assaulted.
There had now been 6 similar attacks in less than a year. 5 women and an unborn baby were dead. Detectives had no leads.
It's difficult to say.
And though Diana had emerged from her coma, the injuries to her brain were taking longer to heal than expected. Without her testimony, identifying the bedroom basher would be difficult. A month later, after being released from the hospital, Diana was finally getting her memory back. And she was anxious to meet with police. Though she had not regained her speech, she was able to communicate the identity of her attacker.
You know what he hit you with?
The person responsible for the death of her baby was not a stranger. It was her husband, Kevin Greene.
Remember what he hit you with?
Police in Costa Mesa and Tustin, California, struggled to identify a suspect in a string of brutal sexual assaults that had claimed the lives of 5 women and 1 unborn child. 20-year-old Diana Greene, who lost her baby as a result of a brutal beating by the suspected serial killer, finally regained her memory of the attack and then filed an official statement with police. Detective Barbara Geisler reviewed Diana's testimony. Diana claimed that her husband, Marine Corps Corporal Kevin Greene, was her assailant. According to Diana, on the night she was assaulted, she and Kevin had a heated argument. Kevin wanted to have sex, but Diana, then 9 months pregnant, refused his advances. As a result, Kevin attacked her, smashing her in the forehead with his keychain before raping her. Suddenly, investigators had to consider that Kevin Greene was also responsible for the other 5 unsolved homicides throughout Orange County. But after retracing his movements over the previous year, it was clear that he could not be the bedroom basher. However, he could have staged the attack on his wife to make it look like the crime of the serial killer.
In fact, the phrase that was coined at that time, and I think is used today, is that possibly the husband had committed the crime, quote unquote, as a look-alike, keeping in mind all of the homicides that were occurring had been publicized greatly throughout the counties.
To confirm their suspicions, police began interviewing the couple's friends and associates. Though Kevin had told police his marriage to Diana was solid, One of the couple's neighbors said that the two would often have heated arguments that could be heard throughout the complex. Investigators next interviewed the couple that had spent time with Kevin and Diana just hours before the assault. They described a tense relationship. They recalled that just after Diana learned she was pregnant, Kevin became abusive toward her during dinner one night. He was convinced she would use the pregnancy to avoid being intimate with him. The friends didn't think the marriage was a happy one. Convinced they were on the right track, investigators brought Kevin Greene in for questioning. Looking to corroborate Diana's story, investigators collected his keychain that he allegedly used to beat her with. Later analysis revealed no traces of blood. But Kevin Greene couldn't explain how or why his wife had memories of him attacking her. He insisted he had nothing to do with her assault. He maintained that at the time of the attack, he was across town getting fast food. For Lieutenant Bill Fisher of the Tustin Police Department, something about the suspect's alibi was suspicious.
One of the things that didn't make a whole lot of sense to us is that the fast food place he went to was an identical one to a fast food restaurant that was directly across the street from where he lived. Both restaurants were open 24 hours for drive-through purposes at the time of the crime. Yet he chose to bypass the one that was across the street and drive to the same type of establishment in the community next door.
Looking to catch Kevin Greene in a lie, investigators interviewed the store employee who had worked the night he allegedly pulled into the drive-thru. The clerk confirmed Kevin Greene's story. She remembered serving him around 1:30 or 2 a.m. on the night of the assault.
Appreciate it.
The information appeared to be a setback for investigators. But when they factored the driving distance into a timeline of the evening, police realized that Kevin would have had just enough time to attack his wife and establish an alibi. More importantly, the suspect could not explain away the eyewitness testimony of his own wife.
She was so emphatic about the fact that it was Kevin that attacked her. We were unable to show anything different.
On November 30th, 1980, the Marine Corps corporal was handed over to police and placed under arrest. Greene maintained his innocence, convinced that the real culprit was the stranger he had seen outside his apartment the night of the assault. Police felt otherwise.
They arrested me and threw me in jail on first-degree murder, attempted murder, and 2 counts of assault with a deadly weapon with great bodily injury. $250,000 bail and headlines for all the world to see. Marine arrested in the beating attack and death of his daughter.
Kevin Greene mounted a strong defense at trial, but Diana's emotional testimony won over the jury. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. Though Greene fought to overturn his conviction, his efforts went unrewarded. 15 years into his sentence, he had exhausted all of his appeals. Because he never showed remorse for the crimes that he insisted he hadn't committed, Kevin Greene was turned down for parole in 1988, 1991, 1993, and 1995. Greene resigned himself to the fact that he would die in prison. A self-proclaimed innocent man. 15 years into a life sentence for assaulting his pregnant wife and killing their unborn baby, Kevin Greene continued to maintain his innocence. But with all of his appeals exhausted, his only hope for justice was that the real culprit, who Greene believed to be the serial killer known as the Bedroom Basher, would someday be caught. But Tustin and Costa Mesa police had been unable to identify a suspect in the 5 unsolved 1979 homicides.
One object, I'm thinking maybe 2x4.
The investigations into those murders had ground to a halt. But in the summer of 1995, Tustin police detective Tom Tarpley learned of a new national database called CODIS, the Combined DNA Identification Index, that had the potential to re-energize those investigations.
We were instructed that a database existed in which you could take evidence from unsolved cases, develop a genetic profile from that evidence, and then that evidence would be put into a computer which is maintained by the state of California that holds genetic profiles of known offenders, people who are in prison or have been convicted of certain serious crimes. So you could take the two genetic profiles and see if there was a match between the unsolved case and the known offender.
Detective Tarpley requested the case files for any of the unsolved serial murders that contained potential DNA evidence.
Here's that file.
Lieutenant Bill Fisher, who had also worked the case against Kevin Greene, had one. He turned over the file of 24-year-old Deborah Kennedy, who was bludgeoned to death within days of the assault on Diana Greene.
When Lieutenant Fisher brought me the Deborah Kennedy case file, I went through that file looking at the physical evidence, and it appeared that there was a rape kit that was taken at the time of her discovery.
Hoping to close one of the unsolved Bedroom Basher murders, detectives retrieved the sexual assault kit and sent it to the Orange County Sheriff's Crime Lab for analysis. But now, more than 16 years since the specimen was collected, criminalist Frank Fitzpatrick wasn't sure if the old sample would be of any use.
The problem was that the sexual assault kit had not been refrigerated, had not been frozen, and we really had no idea of what kind of shape this biological evidence was going to be in. We asked one of our DNA analysts to work through the night and to see what they could do with trying to extract some DNA from this.
Technicians were in luck. Trace amounts of genetic material were extracted from a clipping of Deborah Kennedy's bed sheets. Using the PCR technique, the DNA was then copied so that criminalists would have enough material to test. The analysis produced a genetic profile of Deborah Kennedy's killer. When investigators entered the profile into the CODIS database, they found an identical match. The biological evidence had originated from a man who was currently serving time for rape in a Central California prison. Investigators went to the jail to question 40-year-old Gerald Parker, now linked to one of the Bedroom Basher murders. Though he was indirect and evasive, Parker implied that he was responsible for the Kennedy murder.
He did not, for example, come out and say, "I did this." He just would not say that I didn't do this, which sometimes is just as good as an admission. So it was kind of a game of cat and mouse at that point.
Investigators persisted, and finally Parker admitted to killing Deborah Kennedy. And there was another attack he wanted to talk about. Gerald Parker, a former Marine, claimed that he was the man who had assaulted Diana Greene back in 1979. Her husband, Kevin Greene, was innocent. Parker said that on September 30th, 1979, he slipped into the Greenes' apartment after seeing Kevin get into his car and leave. Using a 2x4, he attacked Diana as she slept in her bed. He then sexually assaulted her and made his way out of the apartment. He completed his brutal attack in less than half an hour and left the apartment just as Kevin returned home. Though police were unable to explain Diana's memory of the assault, they were now confronted with the possibility that Kevin Greene may have been innocent after all.
My feeling was, we've got a big problem here. You know, we've got a guy that is in prison, locked up for a number of years for murder that he didn't commit, but it became our job to show that Parker was in fact the real killer, and that's where the human element came in. We had to get that information from him that could ultimately set Kevin Greene free if in fact he wasn't the offender.
And the best way to do that was through the physical evidence. The biological samples recovered from the Diana Greene case and samples from all of the unsolved bedroom basher murders were sent out for a DNA analysis. At the Orange County Sheriff's Crime Lab, examiners generated a genetic profile of all of the samples. They all shared the same genetic code. And they had all originated from Gerald Parker. The findings were passed on to investigators.
So now we had conclusive physical evidence as well as testimonial evidence that Gerald Parker was there and that he raped Diana Greene. That then created a reasonable doubt in all of our minds in law enforcement that we could not stand by the conviction of Kevin Greene anymore, and the process then began to free him.
On June 20th, 1996, after being locked up for nearly 17 years, Kevin Greene was released from prison. After being driven to the airport by detectives, he made his first phone call as a free man.
I called my dad and I asked him, I said, guess where I'm at? And he'd always thought I would try to escape, so he says, well, I know where you're supposed to be. I told him I'm in the Salinas airport and they're taking me down to Orange County to let me go. I'm coming home. And it was just stunned silence there for a minute, and he says, do you have handcuffs on? I said, nope. And so he believed at that moment that a convicted murderer is not leaving a prison without handcuffs unless he ain't coming back.
In 1998, Gerald Parker was tried and convicted of the assault on Diana Greene and the murder of her unborn child. He was also found guilty of slaying the other 5 bedroom basher victims. Gerald Parker was sentenced to death.
My opinion of the DNA database is that it's probably the single greatest thing to ever happen to law enforcement and into the criminal justice system. Not only can you convict people of crimes that would have gotten away with serious crimes such as rape and murder, but you can also, as we see in the Kevin Greene case, free people that were erroneously convicted.
Kevin Greene returned to his hometown in the Midwest. And though he has remarried and gotten on with his life, this experience will always be with him.
An experience like this, like any other experience in life, is going to change you. Time went by. I changed in a lot of ways. I grew up. I became more mature. I got a good education, which is very important. I learned how to read a lot better. I mean, I graduated high school by the skin of my teeth. I graduated college in prison with an A average. So it wasn't my lack of intelligence, it was my lack of focus. I understand, I think, a lot more about life. I'm willing to accept a lot of things easier than people around me do, because I feel like God has a plan and a reason for things to happen in certain ways.
The experiences of people like Kirk Bloodsworth and Kevin Greene have not gone unnoticed. On February 11, 2000, Vermont Senator Patrick Leahy, chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, introduced the Innocence Protection Act, a bill designed to ensure that no more innocent people are convicted of crimes they didn't commit.
If you're going to say you're going to put somebody behind bars for all their life, or you're going to execute them, that's a pretty major step for society to take. and you better be sure you're convicting somebody who is guilty. Right now we have a system where you can't say that. Right now you have a system where a lot of innocent people get convicted. It doesn't have to be that way. It's relatively easy to make sure that doesn't happen. It's time we make sure it doesn't happen.
Homicide investigators must often rely on circumstantial evidence to win a conviction. But sometimes things aren't what they appear to be. With advanced forensic technology, science can render the final verdict and find justice for the falsely accused by uncovering proof of innocence.